What exactly do we mean when we say, think better, think Austrian? Let's ask the originator of that phrase.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We are here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Economics is a way of thinking. Like everything, it's changing and evolving over time as we gain more knowledge and more experience, and we get to draw upon that pile of history that's accumulating behind us. But there are some foundations of the economic way of thinking that are unchanging and always applicable and always useful for everybody in business. Let's call them first principles. If we start at first principles and work logically step by step from there, we can't go wrong in our reasoning, and we'll arrive at analysis and understanding we can count on. That's the promise of Think Better, Think Austrian. Don't be fooled, don't be diverted. For business thinking, we're focused on customer behavior, primarily buying or not buying. Why do they buy? And how can we understand their motivations sufficiently to align what we're selling with what they prefer to buy? Why do they not buy? And how can we understand their motivations sufficiently to change their behavior to buying what we sell? Reasoning from first principles, understanding why people do anything before we analyze their specific purchase behavior, is a mental discipline that's endlessly beneficial for business people who practice it. Such thinking will inform the experiments you run to trigger buying behavior and illuminate your analysis of the results. Our guide today is Professor Per Bylund. He's the most rigorous of economic thinkers, as you can observe any day on Twitter, where he freely exchanges his thinking. He teaches students up to the PhD level at Oklahoma State University in the Spears School of Business. He's a fellow of the Mises Institute and a leading thinker on value creation, entrepreneurship, and many more topics that are fundamental for business. Per, welcome to the Economics for Business podcast.
Hey, Hunter, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's been a while. We're going to talk today about a powerful tool for business and especially for innovation and marketing, and it's the Austrian study of action or behavior. It's very powerful because business is 100% about action. It's about how customers act, choosing and using goods and services that businesses offer, and it's about businesses act, trying to align with those customers, making them customers in the first place and keeping them from taking an alternative form of action and choosing another supplier. So business is action. And there are some things about action that we can know in advance. We have a mental model for action. So can you give us an overview from the Austrian economics point of view about the study of action?
Sure. I think action, the whole Austrian economics framework really starts with the person. And it places the person at the very center and trying to understand what are people actually trying to do. And based off of that, then we can understand any social interaction, and we can understand anything that they cause, any collaborations they have, any long-term projects that they choose to pursue and things like that. And we all have different goals in mind. And those goals we try to attain in a certain order. And we might choose to discard one goal that we have started to pursue because we find something else that is much more valuable to us, right? So understanding how and why we act, just as you put it, is very important to understand the outcomes of action too, and why people do what they do, how they do what they do. And of course, when you're running a business, you have action all over the place. Action is inside your business when you're trying to coordinate and get your employees to work together towards a common goal, but they have their own personal goals involved as well. You do as the entrepreneur, your customers do as well, and you have to communicate with them in some sense and understand them. So it really always comes down to the personal dimension and people themselves. And I think that's an important I think that's basically what we're going to talk about today: how to use this basic knowledge of what people are like.
Right. Right. And so the economics textbooks talk about purposeful action, understanding that everything that people do has an end in mind, a goal, as you put it. But it's complicated to work out. I was thinking in preparing for this discussion, you can have in mind at the same time the goal of losing weight and the goal of eating a hamburger. One's long term and one's short term. They're both goals. How do we sort out this purposeful action?
Well, that's exactly the thing, and to us personally, it's not really a big issue because in any moment we can sort of feel which one we want to pursue, and that's also where we have those problems where losing weight might be the long term goal and something we want to do, but in that moment we see that hamburger or donut or something like that, and we go like, that's a tasty one. I really want to get a bite of that one. So at that moment, we really feel the urge to satisfy some other want, as we would put it in economics. That we want to get this, taste this, that we think is really, really tasty, the hamburger. And we want to long term also choose, lose weight and look better and be healthier and so forth. And they're not necessarily compatible. In this case, they are not, which means that we will end up in conflict. And after we have the burger, we might be very satisfied with having had the burger, and then we might think that, oh darn it, this is not helping me with my weight. But the way you compare these things is always on your personal terms. It's your own feelings, which is why it's so hard for others to try to help you and try to understand what are you actually doing. And some of us are simply more impulsive than others too. Some of us are really, really structured and systematic and follow the rules, and set rules for ourselves, and we follow those because that's part of the value of doing things, right? So we are complex beings.
Right. So it's hard for marketers and business people to sort this out. But another principle that comes from Austrian economics is, as we start to investigate, we can be sure that people who are acting think that they're changing their circumstances for the better. I think the books call it substituting a superior set of circumstances for an inferior one. I always think I'm making things better. So this idea of betterment is fundamental to this understanding, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the reason we act is because we want to become better in some sense. We want to be better off. We want to satisfy a want. We want to remove uneasiness. We want to just feel better in whatever sense. And we already mentioned such things as a full stomach when maybe we're hungry. That's one urge or desire that we have. But tasting something really tasty rather than having something that just gives us nourishment, that's also a value. Losing weight because we're thinking health is a value to us. All of those things are some things that they're just good for us, and we think they make us better off in some immediate or long-term sense, and that's what we're aiming for. So any just like you mentioned, any action we take is really replacing what we have in the present with something that we think is better. So we're aiming not only to satisfy a goal, but also to become, well, or to place ourselves in that situation where we satisfy that goal, which means we are better off, and that's always what we're aiming for. I mean, you could call it greedy, but that's also a part of being in existence. I mean, there's no other way than forward, and we, whenever we choose to do something, of course we're going to choose something that makes sense to us, that makes us better off on our own terms, that we like to choose. That's what choosing is about. It's all about what we value and how we value it. We wouldn't act at all if we were completely content. So obviously we are not completely content. So we take action. We try to change the world around us. We try to change our behavior, try to change maybe our location, and things like that. And every such change, we think, at least when we start out doing it, we think that it will place us in a better place, in a better world, and better for ourselves.
So the products and services that businesses are providing and selling and marketing, they're to help people achieve that betterment, achieve those ends. And in economics, we call them means. Those are means to get to the end, to achieve the betterment. But they're only means in the customer's head, right? They're not. We can't objectively identify them as the best means. The means is in their heads. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the problem, right? That everything really comes down to the subjective perception of the person. So as an entrepreneur, I might think that I have a great solution to a problem that I think a lot of people have. So I provide that product or service or experience, whatever. But it doesn't mean that other people think of it as a means toward that end. It also doesn't mean that they actually have that end. So, and that's the problem of the communication, right? That what we see as means is necessarily something that we understand and that we think will take us to this better place. It will provide us with this value. And that's highly problematic. I mean, one way of thinking about it is if you've seen a small child and you give that child something like a spoon or a string or something like that, they will use it in a very different way than most people will use it. And because they will just see it and they will think, oh, I can probably use it for this, and they do something that to us it would be crazy to use a spoon in that way. But to the child, that seems like a good means for some end that they want to attain. And then, of course, we learn when we grow up. We learn that certain means can be used towards certain ends, and we learn that maybe a spoon is much better for eating soup than for, I don't know, drumming or whatever a child might do with it. And but then we also get stuck in our ways, right? But we learn that certain technologies, in a general sense, are very suitable for certain ends. So we use those to satisfy those ones and become better off in some sense. But very often, you could think of the consumer as that child from the perspective of the entrepreneur, because very often an entrepreneur would create some new good or service. They would sell it in the market and be surprised at how the consumer actually uses that product, because they bought it for a different reason than you thought that you sold it for, which is marvelous, right? Because it means that we have different imagination and different views of the world and different understandings of how to use things. But it also makes it really difficult to place that sale and sort of try to predict how to use these things. And it also makes the relationship so important, that you have to communicate with your consumer and your customer, not only to place the sale, but after the fact too, because you can learn something about the product that you sold that you didn't think of, but the consumer did.
Right. So another way to say that is that we can't judge the customer's decision about which means to achieve which end. That's up to them. But we can discover something about how they think, how they link means and ends, right? It's a discovery process for business.
Yeah, exactly. And that's also where brands come in. I mean, a brand changes the customer's experience of using the product and maybe the whole relationship with your business. But it doesn't necessarily change the physical product. That same physical product can be sold by someone else. And very often we have exactly this thing in clothing, say, with knockoff brands. They're produced in the same factory as some big name brand, and it's exactly the same thing, but it's not real, quote unquote, right? Because it's not actually Ralph Lauren or whatever it is, right? It's just a knockoff. Physically speaking, it's exactly the same thing, but a customer might still choose to pay 4 times more for the real Ralph Lauren from a Ralph Lauren store, even if it's online, just because they know it's real, because they trust it in a different way. To them, it's a different thing altogether. And this again goes to how important it is to try to understand not only what you're selling, but to whom you're selling it and who you are in the eyes of your customer.
A quick note. Economics for Business is a uniquely Austrian platform to help entrepreneurs build value-generating businesses at every stage of the entrepreneurial journey. We've now launched online with an outstanding database of entrepreneurial knowledge, tools to solve specific business problems, and a community exchange to share information and experiences. Check it out at econ4business.com. That's ECON, the number 4, business.com. Explore and let us know what works best for you in the feedback section. Now, back to our conversation.
Right. I was thinking about that in the context of wine. I was talking to a friend of mine with a winery just this morning, and if you go to Costco, you can find Kirkland's signature wine, and you can find the most expensive $200 bottles of wine from another brand. A lot of them come from the same vineyards and the same grapes, and you make your choice on a different basis, whether you want to be seen with a bottle of Kirkland's signature on your dinner table.
Yeah, exactly. And the same thing where you shop. Right? If you go to a grocery store, you can go to a grocery store, let's say Walmart or something like that. But some people, they prefer to pay twice as much or 3 times as much because they go to Whole Foods. The carrots might be the same damn carrots, right? But it for some people, it just they would rather be found dead than go to Walmart, or vice versa. I don't know, but and they're ready to pay for it. So you're actually selling a different good. The carrot in Walmart is different than the carrot in Whole Foods from the consumer's point of view.
So we can start to make some progress here in that you said in a previous podcast, means are always scarce to the customer relative to the ends that they have in mind. You've got to choose one over the other, and in fact, you prefer one alternative over the other, right? It's always a choice.
Yeah, exactly. And there's, I mean, in terms of just ends, how can you make your life better now and into the future? Well, there are billions of ways you can do that. So you have to pick one of those. And then, of course, you have different means available, and those means are, you think, suitable towards satisfying certain wants, and that's attaining some ends. But you can always use a little more. You can always become better off if you had even more means. And if you had more of the means that you have, or if you have more types of means. So, and that's sort of the struggle, and why we work and why we invest and why economic growth is so important, because that provides us with more and better means to satisfy our wants. And that is what scarcity means, that we cannot become fully content in this moment because we don't have the means to do that. So we cannot take a step right now into the Garden of Eden. That's not possible. We can take steps forward, or sometimes it's simply that we see that things are going the wrong way, and we act in order to not make it as wrong. Right? But it's still betterment compared to where we think we might end up. And every action always aims at betterment in some sense.
So I've read in the textbooks, Per, that customers act or consumers act on a scale of wants and values. Something is, you use the term, more urgent at one point in time relative to another. One means is a better choice than another at a point in time. It might change over time, but consumers don't think like that, right? We can't ask them for your scale of values. You just chose the burger. Was that at the top of your scale of values? They're not going to be able to think like that, right? We can't ask them those kinds of questions.
No, it doesn't make any sense. It's a conceptual tool. I mean, we do have shopping lists and things like that, and we might have a wish list for Christmas that we send to Santa Claus, right? Or at least when we were younger, maybe we did. But it's still not, how do we become better off in every sense, and then how do we rank those things? That's simply not. It's not doable, and it's also not something we waste time on, because it's more important to actually act on something than to think through all the possibilities, right? So sometimes it's just satisfying, trying to become better off right now. It's better to act than to think, maybe I should spend another 2 hours and think about all the other versions of this action that I can take. That doesn't make any sense, because there's a cost to that too. So we always make this judgment, but it's always a comparison. So it's a comparison between what we have today and the best alternative. And that is always based on a feeling. Because being better off is a feeling, it's an experience. So it's based in a sense on our own personal experience of becoming better, of acting previously in our life, watching others act and things like that. But it's always the comparison, which thing do I have 5 goods to choose from? Well, okay, then you pick the good that you think is more suitable for your needs, or you pick the one that you think is more beautiful, or if you don't have time to choose or don't really care about thinking about the thing, you might pick the one that is just closest to you. But for some reason, you pick one and you do not pick the other ones, right? So that's the opportunity cost. That whatever we choose, that's what we felt in that moment anyway was of highest value. What we did not choose, that's what we lose out on because we didn't choose it. And that is always the calculation that we make in a sense, or the comparison that we make. We're going for some value, and then we're going to lose the other values because we obviously didn't choose those.
Right. We've talked about opportunity cost in the past, and we can link to that particular podcast. But I want to add another ingredient now, which I think marketers or salespeople or businesses in general often neglect, which is the effect of context. There are no context-free kinds of decisions. When people make that comparison, do I choose A or B? It's in the context of their personal circumstances, their social circumstances, their family circumstances. It's always context. This is not a theoretical A versus B. It's A in context and B in context.
Yeah, exactly. And one of those classical examples is ice cream in the summer versus ice cream in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
And they're obviously not the same good. I mean, the ice cream is the same, but we're not very interested in ice cream in the winter. So we don't even consider that a good, because a good is something that's the means that we can use to satisfy an end. So it's something that we use to attain that end. And we usually have ice cream in the summer because we want to cool down. We rarely want to cool down in the winter. So it's not something that we consider even a means in the winter, perhaps, which is why also many ice cream shops and so forth, they're simply closed in the winter. I mean, unless you live really far in the south, where it is hot. But it's exactly right that all these choices, I mean, since we're talking about attaining some end that we feel will make us better off, of course it's going to be context based. It's going to be we're going to consider anything that we consider important at that moment. If we're in a certain family situation, if we're in a certain location, if we are say in the midst of starting a career, whatever it might be, if we're in a relationship or if we're not, all of those things matter to us because they affect our choices and they affect our preferences. So we will choose different things depending on these contexts. It's not really hard to understand when you place that person and that person's valuation at the center and start with that. It is hard when you start with just a physical product, because then it doesn't really make any sense. Why would you sell so much ice cream in July but not in December? Because it's the same product. And I mean, it sounds like a stupid example, but if we just want to produce a model for it, well, you have to understand the people and where the people are at when they buy ice cream and why they buy ice cream in order to sell it. And if you simply disregard that dimension, then you're going to produce a whole lot of ice cream in the winter and not sell any.
Right. So we've got an advantage there for our way of thinking, which is that contextual way and understanding means and ends. We've gone through all of that. There's another point which I think can be really useful to business, and that is that the motivation that people have is to relieve unease. Action is taken by discontented people, as the note that I wrote to myself. Unease is they're dissatisfied with a certain situation. That's the reverse of betterment, right? I'm dissatisfied. I think things should be better. So they're always trying to relieve unease. And I think Mises said that that's the only thing they do. That's always their motivation. And in marketing, certainly we were taught to Rory Sutherland, when he was here the other week, talked about pile on the positives. You're always promising some benefit, but actually, if you think of things from relieving unease, you might have a better sense of how to go to market. So, talk to us about relieving unease. How should we understand that?
Right, and that goes back to our discussion before about how we're not fully content. And it's not only about attaining a value. It might be to simply avoid some harm or some discomfort that you have now or that you see might happen to you. So just like I mentioned a minute ago, that it could be that you see that, oh, everything is going wrong, everything is going down the drains, and then you make decisions, not because that those decisions will make you better off compared to where you are now, but they, at least to you, will make you better off compared to the alternative in the future. Right? So it's better meant in the sense that, oh, the alternatives are worse. And it sounds pessimistic and negative, but I don't think it is, because the alternative is to start in the Garden of Eden type of existence, and we're not in the Garden of Eden. There's so much that we can do, and so much we don't even understand that we could be able to do, especially in the future if we would travel through time and travel to, I don't know, 2300 or something. We would probably be able to satisfy a whole lot of wants that we didn't even understand that we had, and our existence would be so much better for it. So there's really no end to how much better off we can become. And I think that is part of Mises's point, that there's always this urge in us that drives us, the motivation to become better off. And that urge is part of the unease we're feeling, because we realize that, oh, we could be better off. So therefore we take action. Right? That it's not only the value itself, it's also escaping the lack of value.
Right. I find the relief of unease a good analytical tool, because, as you say, you start to put yourself in the mind of the customer. I could be uneasy about, what will people think of me if I buy this car? How do I look in these clothes? How hard is it going to be to use this computer? Those are all kind of uneasiness questions that are solved by convenience or cheapness or design or whatever, but starts with unease. I find that a good analytical tool.
Yeah, exactly. And that would also explain, say, herd behavior. Say college students, they all dress alike, or at least it looks like it from an outside view, right? And suddenly there's a new fad or a new fashion, and suddenly they all have the same shorts. And why? Well, they want to belong to the group too. I mean, it's not easy to stand out and be different. So it has to mean a lot to you in order for you to choose it. Or it makes sense. I mean, if standing out, especially if you're a teenager, that could be really hard to be your own and sort of have a reason when all the friends are in a different way, right? So you buy into whatever the fad is and whatever the short or whatever is required, right, to fit in, even if it costs you a lot, because you want to escape that feeling of not belonging, a feeling of not being part of the gang or group, or and anything really that you value as a person. And you're learning, of course, over time, because it's not as important to most people when you become older, say when you're 30 or 40. It's not as important to have the same brand of pants as everybody else in the workplace. But when you're on a college campus, then it's really important, right? Because people look at those things. So you learn to become your own and learn what you like and what you don't like and what matters to you and what doesn't matter. But that's sort of a personal change that happens over time, your experience of just living and being yourself.
Right. So we've got a couple of analytical tools. We talked about context. We talked about relieving unease and betterment and so on. But the method that you're the expert on, I think, is deduction. We talked about the deductive method. Sometimes in marketing, we call it insights, which is, I think, a product of deduction. I think of it as working backwards. But tell us about deduction. You're the expert, and you're a deduction machine. So tell us how that works.
Right. So it's really, in a way, reasoning from first principles. So knowing that action is purposeful behavior, that we want to attain a certain end because we like it for whatever reason, it means that when you see someone acting in a certain way, and we all have the experience seeing someone act in a way you go like, that's crazy, or why does he do that, or that doesn't make any sense. But from that, I mean, that's judging people, which is easy. But if you want to understand what they're doing, then you backtrack, just like you said, thinking backwards from that, saying, okay, so they're doing that. They must be trying to attain some end because they're doing that for a purpose, something that makes sense to them, whatever it is. And it could be something completely crazy, and it could be something that is really harmful and dangerous too, or it could be just something mundane. It doesn't really matter. But anything they do, any action we take, from our perspective, we know that it has to have made sense, and you have to have figured that it would make you better off compared to all the alternatives, right? So no one can really take that away from you, and we can, because they acted in this weird way, because, as we said before, an entrepreneur sells this new product to a customer, and the customer uses it in a different way, even though the entrepreneur probably communicated to them how it was intended or produced to use, the consumer used it in a different way. Why? Because they figured that way would be more helpful, more valuable to them. So we can immediately see that there's a rationale for it, which is also why we said a minute ago that you need that relationship with the customer to learn from the customer. Why did you use the product this way that I did not foresee? I did not predict that you would use it this way. But as soon as you realize that they used it that way, not because they're stupid and not because they're ignorant, not because they're destructive. I mean, that's just judging them, which is definitely the wrong way of going about running a business. Instead, realizing that, they're seeing some other value in this use that to them must be much higher than the value I thought that I was selling to them, right? Which means that you should study them. You should talk to them. You should try to figure out what is going on, and maybe you can tweak the product to really help this customer and other customers like him or her to satisfy that same end. Maybe more people have the same problem, but this guy was imaginative enough to use this product in an unexpected way. But just because we understand already the principle, we understand the nature of action itself, we can identify that certain things must be true about this action. So instead of judging, we can learn from it, and we can use it to our own advantage.
Now, is that method, the deductive method, is that what Austrian economics calls praxeology? Is that the tool?
Yeah, exactly. So praxeology is really starting with the concept of action as we have described it, as purposeful behavior. And then from there, deriving what else must be true. And we talked about some of these things already, although not in sort of philosophical, logical sense, that in order to attain an end, you have to use means. Because if you don't have to use means to attain an end, well, why haven't you already attained that end? You have, because nothing is stopping you, right? Because there's no means necessary, no things, no time, no effort, nothing. So you should have already attained it. So you need means, which is all the products and services that we're making available. It also means that, well, you're aiming for something, but there's plenty of uncertainty involved. So you might not necessarily get the value that you're aiming for. You might not actually get the product or the situation you're aiming for either. Or it could be the case that you actually attain what the situation that you were aiming for, but it's not really what you thought it would be. So there's plenty of uncertainty involved too. And Austrian economics continues this sort of logical deduction, deriving what must be true about action, and step by step adding meaning to it. And then eventually we're going to end up with, say, the business cycle theory and things like that, simply by adding obvious next steps to our understanding what action actually is.
Yep. Yeah, it's a powerful tool, and we're trying hard to kind of make it available in different ways. Let me try out another heuristic on you, and that's one that I find useful, is the ideal type. I call it one perfect customer. And the idea is that marketing used to look at market segments, which are averages, and you're trying to theorize that this 50 million people is different from that 50 million people on such and such a dimension. But if you start with one perfect customer and then try and apply the deductive method to that one perfect customer and understand their context, you might be able to arrive at some form of understanding, and then you can project it to more theoretically. But starting with one, what do you think about that as a heuristic?
I think it works really well as a heuristic. It not necessarily for theorizing on the economy as an academic like myself, but for running a business, I think it's a great way of doing it. I know other methods they use the term persona in order to sort of specify what type of customer they're aiming for. Ideal type is probably it's better because you get ideal in there. So it's not just persona, any persona, because I think sometimes students have they struggle with personas because they just think of different persons instead of producing sort of an abstract model in a sense of what the perfect customer would be like. An ideal type, and then you get that, well, it's ideal for you for some, or the product for in some sense, and it's a type, it's not the person. Right? So I think it's less confusing in that sense. But I think definitely you should start with what would this whatever I'm offering, what would the perfect customer look like? What is the ideal type? And then expand that, of course. Sometimes, or some scholars talk about the beachhead market, where you try to get a foothold in the market by exploiting. Well, that's not a good word, but by exploring and offering your product to that one ideal customer. And that is enough to cover your costs so that you can then expand and tweak the product too, probably, but expand to other customers that might not be as willing to pay as high a price, say. So, I mean, that's how you should start to try to penetrate the market and then move on from there. Or maybe not move on. I mean, there are plenty of companies that are in a certain segment and they don't want to move from that segment. I mean, Apple is an example. Their premium segment product, they don't want to, and I don't think they should produce low price computers and cell phones, say, because that would destroy their brand. I mean, their ideal type is not every Apple user. Their ideal type is a certain type of Apple user, probably the people sleeping on sidewalks when there's new iPhone being released, right? That could be the ideal type, because they're more than willing to not only pay $1,000 for a cell phone, but also sleep on the sidewalk a couple of nights to get it. So they're obviously very loyal. But then you have more customers who would, I mean, it doesn't really matter to them if it's an Apple or if it's another smartphone. But then they can offer them something in addition, right? And get a bigger market share.
Yeah. The ideal type is sleeping on the sidewalk. That's a good picture. Only in one moment in time, though. So, Per, we're trying to help businesses here, help practitioners, and so I'd like to talk about some ways that we can do that. My favorite, and you and I talked about this a little bit before we started recording, is marketing. That understanding, relieving unease, understanding subjective value, understanding how individuals calculate what means to achieve what ends. That's exactly what marketing is about, and so we can really help marketers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can apply this idea really in any part of the business to understand it better by figuring out how it contributes. We talked about this before. How can you contribute to consumer value in every decision that you make in the business? Does this contribute to consumer value? That's the first question to ask. And then, do I need it in-house? Because that ties up capital, that ties up, well, your own time too. Or can I place it in the marketplace and focus on where I actually contribute value? So this goes into everything really, and how you organize your business. And I think everywhere it makes sense to have action as your starting point and seeing the person or the type of person, the ideal type, and figuring out how to satisfy this person on their own terms.
Yeah, and a subset of marketing then is brands, which you've mentioned. And one of the discussions I got into the other day, and I think you might enjoy, was talking about Red Bull, the beverage that, if you think about it in product terms, it doesn't taste very good. It looks weird. You don't get a full 12 ounces because it comes in a tiny can. Any kind of functional analysis for Red Bull doesn't make any sense, but people act. They love it. They drink it. They consume it. They have fun with it. They mix it with vodka. God knows what they do with it. But that's an example of a brand that's got to be built on praxeology, right? Understanding why people choose Red Bull.
Well, I thought they chose it because it gives them wings.
Well, that's right. Isn't that a brilliant campaign? Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, it is the brand, and they were early, and they managed to. I mean, the Red Bull and vodka drink, as you mentioned, became a thing, and a big campaign. I mean, you can't really trick the customer, especially long term, but you can inspire and motivate the customer and provide them with an image of why this product matters and why this product is different from other products. And it can be different. It also can be pretty much the same, right?
Mhm.
It's the same thing with automobile brands, that some automobile brands, they have a lot of advertising, and they always advertise sort of an image of a different life, a trouble-free, problem-free existence where the sun is shining, you have a beautiful woman by your side, all this stuff, right? It gives you a feeling that with this car, this is possible. But if you buy something else, if you buy a regular Ford or something, it's not possible, right? And usually it's a finer car too, but it's that's not all they're selling. They're selling this idea, and this idea is more important to people than the car itself, probably.
Yep. This internalized idea, when I internalize it in my own mind. Yeah. So another entrepreneurial story that I love, and we're being well balanced here for our female listeners, Sarah Blakely, who invented Spanx, and that became a billion-dollar business. Her insight was that consumers are uneasy, female consumers are uneasy about their appearance when wearing, shall we say, close-fitting garments. They want smoothness, and the idea of Spanx was to give them that positive feeling that they've got this smooth look inside a close-fitting dress. She thought from the uneasy customer's point of view. I thought that was a great piece of she wouldn't call it Austrian, but a great piece of Austrian thinking.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And there's plenty of Austrian thinking. That the problem, though, that I think you agree with is that there are nuggets of Austrian thinking that people use and that entrepreneurs use successfully, but they could get so much more out of the situation. They could satisfy more people, they could satisfy people in a better way, and they could earn more money too, if they would consider more than that one nugget that they happen to come across or discover themselves, right? By simply, sometimes it's just about getting a language for how to think about these things, or that's just hearing someone verbalize the principle, or just learning that there is a theory that tells us how things actually work, and then realizing that, oh, that's actually not a bad idea, or I didn't think of that, but that's exactly what I've experienced. And very often, I think I mentioned this on this podcast before, that talking with experienced entrepreneurs, they're very often Austrians, because they have learned through experience all those nuggets, all this wisdom, but they don't have the framework, they don't have the system to put the pieces together. And they're probably missing a few pieces too. But by studying, by listening to this podcast, they could learn more broadly how to think about things. And the right kind of thinking is not a recipe for success, but it is a way of avoiding errors.
Right, and this concept of working backwards, the deductive method, I think is really one that can be applied pretty broadly. There's a technique that's often used called 5 whys. So we're asking why customers act this way. You find some answer, but there's still another why. Well, why did they do that? Why didn't they choose the other thing? Why why. You keep asking why, then you uncover, I think, all of those extra nuggets that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And but it's also important, I think, that you don't follow the rule of asking why, but you ask why for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
So when I teach my students sometimes how to think about things, that you always have to ask questions. Well, it's easy to be like a 4-year-old and say, why, why, why? But you're not getting anywhere because you're not actually directing the question. You're not actually trying to get anywhere. You just
Mm-hmm.
you're just placing all the responsibility for actually getting information on the person you're asking, rather than trying to actually penetrate and get some knowledge out of the situation, right? Because it requires that the person you're asking already knows both why you're asking and where it might lead. So just like you said, I mean, why are they thinking this way? Why are they acting this way? What is it that they might have seen that I don't recognize? I mean, so more specific questions than just the I mean, they might also start with the word why,
Mm-hmm.
but more specific, so that you get more actionable information.
Yep. Good. And one last point. That actionable information, it comes from, you called it conversations, the systems thinking folks call it feedback loops, but you've got to operate those, right? You've got to ask the question, have the conversation, you get the data back, then you've got to formulate your new action. So one of the things I always think is that speed of making those changes is a better way of thinking about business than planning and strategy. It's about speed of action, coming back to action, which we talked about at the beginning. It's you've got to act on those feedback loops.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked before on this podcast about agility and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. How and you can't be agile unless you're actually listening and trying to gather that information. So unless you get that feedback, you can't be agile because you have nothing to respond to. So I think responsiveness to everything that you see and hear, but first you act to actually see and hear things.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise, if you just passively sit there and if some information comes your way, you act on it, that's going to mean that you're too late and you're acting on too little information too. So you have to actively seek this information. And I think a good way of thinking about it is to form a relationship with your customer, not just sell a product. I mean, and even if you have a sort of a customer support center or something like that, if something, here's the product, thanks for the money. If something happens, call us. No, but
Mm-hmm.
check in with them again. Maybe have a meeting with some of the customers, observe them, or see your product in action. Try to get this information that is out there, but that most people they don't bother trying to get, and I mean, sometimes you don't have time to get it either. But I mean, some customers, and I do that myself, are more than willing to tell companies what they did right and what they did wrong. But very often, companies, especially big corporations, they don't want to listen. They definitely do not want to hear from their customers because that's a cost, right? So you go to their website and you can't figure out how to contact them at all. It's impossible, right? But many customers, they want to share information. So be responsive to that and be open to that information too.
Yeah. So I think the Austrian approach to business is very different if we can articulate it well to help people. It's this constant flow, constant change, seeking the feedback, acting on the feedback, and getting into that fast flow loop. I've seen business writers call it the age of agile and the digital age. It's a third age, or the fourth age maybe we're up to. But this Austrian idea of the market as a process of constant flux of flow, it's a very different way of doing business.
Yeah, it is indeed. And we talked about how it is the value of your product when it is in use that matters. Well, the world is always changing, which means the use of your product is changing. The role and place for your product in the world is changing, which is why you probably need to change the product or change its positioning, and probably need to develop new products at some point,
Mm-hmm.
just to fit and just to continue to have a rationale for your business. Because the only rationale for your business is that you're satisfying customers' wants. That's how you get paid.
Yep. Good. Well, Per, we're constantly trying to capture all this in a systematic fashion. That's what we do at econforbusiness.com, and you're one of our great guides in this progress towards the Austrian way of doing business. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me, Hunter.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit econforbusiness.com. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.